All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely. Always ready to dig in.
Today, we're heading to Mozambique.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's been, well, let's just say things are pretty tense over there.
Tense.
Yeah, we've got articles on post-election turmoil, protests, violence, even a prison break.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack.
It is. That's why we're here. We're going to trace this unrest back to its roots.
Get to the heart of it.
Exactly. And see how it's playing out, not just in Mozambique, but in the whole region.
Makes sense. There are always those ripple effects.
Right. It's all connected. But before we dive in, think about this. Thousands of prisoners escaped during this chaos.
Thousands.
Yep. Adds a whole new dimension to the story, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, to really grasp what's going on, you have to look past the headlines.
Yeah.
Right? This isn't just some sudden explosion.
Right. It's got deep roots.
Years of political history, social tensions, economic woes, all tangled up together.
All coming to a head, it seems like. So let's rewind to that election on October 9th. Frelimo, the party that's been ruling Mozambique since it got independence in 1975, they declared victory.
A long time in power.
Yeah, and this win. Not exactly a smooth one.
Yeah, Frelimo, they've had their share of accusations over the years, haven't they?
Yeah.
Election rigging, silencing opposition, that sort of thing.
But this time, it's different. Even the international election observers, the ones who are supposed to make sure things are fair.
Right, the neutral parties.
Yeah, even they're raising red flags, talking about irregularities and voter suppression.
Really?
Yeah. It makes you question, well, how legitimate is this win, really? And Frelimo's hold on power, is it slipping?
Interesting. So then, what happened?
Well, hold on to your hats. The Constitutional Council, basically Mozambique's highest court when it comes to elections,
I see.
they confirmed Frelimo's victory on December 23rd.
Despite the opposition's claims of fraud.
Yep, talk about a powder keg.
I bet that didn't go over well.
You guessed it. Protests erupt and they turn violent fast.
Makes sense. People are frustrated.
Absolutely. Over 21 people were killed in clashes with police just right after that court decision.
Wow.
And that's not all. A civil society group that's been tracking this whole thing, they say over 130 people have died in clashes with police since the unrest first began.
That's heartbreaking. It's easy to forget that behind those numbers, those are real people.
Right. Lives lost, families shattered, whole communities torn apart. And it highlights something crucial. These protests, they're about so much more than just the election itself.
I was going to say, there must be something deeper going on.
Definitely. There's a whole history of social and economic grievances in Mozambique, issues that have been festering for years.
Years, maybe even decades, right?
You got it. Like a pressure cooker, just waiting to blow.
So the election was like that final spark.
It was the trigger, yeah, but the fuel for this fire, it comes from deeper issues. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, you name it.
Makes sense. These are issues that don't just disappear overnight.
And they've created this sense of disillusionment, especially among young people who feel like the system's rigged against them.
Yeah, like they've got no stake in the future.
Exactly. And then on Christmas Day, like things couldn't get any more volatile, we get this massive prison break in Maputo.
Why?
Seriously. Over 1,500 prisoners, some of them linked to armed groups, they escape. Imagine that chaos.
Wow, that throws a whole other wrench into things.
It does. It's like what's already a dangerous situation just got a whole lot more complicated. And here's the thing. There's no clear story on what caused this riot.
Really?
Yeah. Some reports say it was protests outside the prison, the unrest just spilling over. Others say it was internal tensions within the prison itself.
So no one's really sure what sparked it.
Nope. But the result's the same. Massive security breach. And who knows what the consequences will be.
That's unsettling.
Totally. People are terrified, and rightfully so. It's not just about political protests anymore. It's about personal safety,
Makes sense. When you have that many people, especially some with ties to armed groups, suddenly out on the streets, it changes the whole dynamic.
Absolutely. And it's not just Mozambique that's worried.
I was going to say, this can't be contained within borders, can it?
You're right. South Africa especially. They're feeling the heat. They've got close ties to Mozambique economically, and they're starting to feel the squeeze.
I see. So what are they doing about it?
Well, their officials are expressing concern, some even calling for intervention. They're stepping up security at the border, too.
So they're definitely taking it seriously.
Oh, absolutely. But it's a tricky situation. It's that whole balancing act,
Right, wanting to help but not overstep.
Exactly. Respecting Mozambique's sovereignty while also trying to prevent things from spiraling out of control.
Not an easy position to be in.
Not at all. And then there's the whole historical connection between Frelimo and the ANC, South Africa's ruling party.
Oh, right. I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, they go way back, fought side by side against apartheid. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to any potential intervention, wouldn't you say?
It does. It raises the question, would South Africa be seen as a neutral party or just trying to prop up an old friend?
Right. That perception matters. It's a delicate dance.
Yeah.
Any intervention would have to be carefully considered, weighing the need for stability against the risk of looking like they're meddling.
Definitely. A lot of factors to juggle.
A lot of factors. And all this is happening in a region that's already facing its own set of challenges.
Yeah, Southern Africa has its share of problems.
Big time. Economic disparities, xenophobia, resource scarcity, you name it. It's like the tension's already there.
Simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. And this unrest in Mozambique, it's like throwing a match onto a pile of dry leaves.
I see your point. It could easily ignite those existing issues.
And that's what's so worrying.
Yeah.
The potential for a domino effect, instability spreading across borders.
A real regional security concern.
It is. And that border between South Africa and Mozambique, it's a crucial trade route, vital for both economies.
Right, the flow of goods and people.
But it's also a potential flashpoint. The increased security, while necessary, it could disrupt that flow.
Ah, a catch-22.
Right. It's like you try to contain the crisis, but those very actions could end up making things worse, hurting the economies even more, and that just fuels resentment.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And as always, it's the everyday people who suffer the most.
Right. We can talk about geopolitics and all that, but we can't forget about the human cost.
The families forced to flee, the communities living in fear, the people just trying to get by as the economy takes a hit.
The human side of the story.
Their stories often get lost in the bigger picture, but they're the ones who bear the brunt of it all.
Absolutely. And the impact goes beyond the physical.
Yeah.
The psychological trauma, the fear, the uncertainty, that leaves scars.
Scars that can last a lifetime.
And affect future generations.
It's a sobering reminder that these aren't just, abstract political events happening somewhere far away. These are real people, real lives being turned upside down.
It brings it home, doesn't it?
It does. And it underscores the urgency of finding a way out of this mess, a path towards peace and stability. But it's not as simple as just, cracking down and restoring order.
Right, that's just a temporary fix.
It's about creating a Mozambique where everyone feels like they belong, where they have opportunities, where their voices are heard, where they can live without fear.
A more just and equitable society.
Exactly. So as we keep exploring this complex situation, I want to shift gears a bit. Let's delve into the factors that got Mozambique to this point, the historical roots of these tensions. How did we get here?
To understand that, we need to go way back to Mozambique's colonial past, the fight for independence. It's a history marked by exploitation, inequality, a brutal war, things that leave deep scars.
Let's unpack that history then. Mozambique was a Portuguese colony for centuries, right?
Yep, almost 500 years. And like most colonial regimes, it was all about extracting resources, exploiting the local population.
Taking what they could get.
Exactly. They had this rigid social hierarchy, Portuguese settlers at the top, indigenous population at the bottom, denied basic rights, no opportunities.
A classic colonial system. So when Mozambique finally got its independence in 1975, it was like stepping out of a long, oppressive shadow. What was the mood like back then?
It was a mix of hope and apprehension. Frelimo, the liberation movement, they came to power with this socialist vision, wanted to create a more equal society.
A fresh start.
That was the idea. But they also inherited a country ravaged by war, the economy in shambles, deep social divisions.
So a lot of challenges from the get-go.
Huge challenges. And Frelimo's rule, well, it's been the defining force in Mozambique's post-colonial journey. Almost 50 years in power now.
Wow. So what kind of impact has that had on the country's development, would you say?
It's a mixed bag, really. Early on, they made progress in areas like education and healthcare, expanded access to basic services.
Some positive steps.
Yeah. But their socialist policies, they got criticized too, particularly from the West, who saw them as being too cozy with the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Caught in that global power struggle.
Exactly. And internally, there were rumblings of discontent, too.
People weren't completely happy with Frelimo.
No. There were growing concerns about their authoritarian tendencies, cracking down on dissent, not delivering on those promises of economic prosperity.
So a disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality.
You got it. And that discontent fueled an armed insurgency, Frelimo, backed by apartheid-era South Africa and Rhodesia.
trying to destabilize the newly independent nation.
Basically, yeah. It was a proxy war in a lot of ways.
Mozambique, caught in the middle of this global and regional power struggle, must have been a turbulent time.
It was. The war with Frelimo, it devastated the country even further. Millions displaced, development stalled, a climate of fear and mistrust took hold, making those social tensions even worse.
So the seeds of the current unrest, were they planted back then?
It's hard to say for sure, but you can definitely see the connections. The struggle for liberation, it gave way to new forms of conflict and inequality.
Old wounds never fully healed.
Exactly. And in Mozambique, those wounds are closely tied to issues of land ownership, control over resources, themes that you see all over Africa.
Land and resources always at the heart of things.
Right. Land, it's not just about economics in many African societies. It's about identity, heritage, belonging. During colonial rule, huge chunks of land were taken from indigenous communities, given to European settlers.
Creating that legacy of dispossession.
Exactly. And that legacy, it casts a long shadow.
So even though Mozambique achieved political independence, those economic structures, they remained largely untouched, perpetuating that inequality.
It's like a time bomb ticking away.
And then comes the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union collapses, a new era begins. How did all that impact Mozambique?
It shifted the political landscape dramatically. Frelimo, without their Soviet support, they embraced a more market-oriented approach.
Adapting to the new reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Opened up the country to foreign investment. Adopted a multi-party system.
A big shift away from those socialist ideals of the liberation struggle.
A pragmatic move, you could say. And it did bring some economic benefits.
So the economy started to grow.
It did. But that growth, it came with a cost. Inequality actually got worse.
How so?
Well, foreign investors, they often partnered with elites connected to Frelimo. Wealth and power got concentrated in the hands of a select few.
The rich got richer.
Basically, yeah. And that fueled resentment, especially among those who were left out of the economic boom, created fertile ground for social unrest.
So it's against this backdrop, this history of grievances and growing economic inequality, that we see the current unrest playing out.
It's a culmination of decades of simmering tensions, a mix of political frustration, economic hardship, and this deep desire for a more just society.
A powder keg waiting for a spark.
And that spark, it seems, was the recent election.
This is where the story takes a darker turn, where those simmering tensions boil over into open conflict. Let's dig into the events leading up to that election and the outbreak of violence.
All right, let's do it.
In the years before the 2024 election, there was this feeling of disillusionment with Frelimo's rule.
People losing faith.
Yeah. Even though the economy was growing, a lot of Mozambicans felt like they weren't seeing the benefits. Corruption was rampant, basic services were lacking, opportunities seemed limited unless you were part of Frelimo's inner circle.
So that gap between the official narrative of progress and the reality on the ground, it was widening.
Exactly, and that created this sense of frustration, a longing for change.
Especially among the younger generation.
Especially among the youth. They'd grown up in a post-war, multi-party Mozambique, but they felt stifled, like the system was rigged against them.
Their hopes and dreams blocked by a system that didn't seem to care.
And that discontent, it found a voice in the opposition parties.
They saw an opportunity.
They did. Frelimo, the main opposition, they tapped into that widespread dissatisfaction.
Frelimo. Isn't that the group that used to be an armed insurgency?
That's them. They transitioned into a political party back in the 90s. And they were promising to clean up corruption, improve living standards, create a more inclusive society.
So the stage was set for a potentially contentious election.
Big time. The opposition felt like this could be their chance to break Frelimo's grip on power.
A real turning point.
The atmosphere was electric. There was this feeling in the air that this election could be a new beginning for Mozambique.
A chance for real change.
But that hope for a peaceful, democratic transition, it was shattered when violence erupted after the election results were announced.
It's a sad reminder of how fragile peace can be, how quickly hope can turn to despair.
It really is, and it shows what can happen when a political system fails to meet the needs and aspirations of its people.
A system that's out of touch, out of sync with the realities on the ground.
Exactly. And this story, it's still unfolding. There are no easy answers, no clear path forward. But by understanding the historical context, by peeling back layers of complexity, by listening to the voices of those caught in the crossfire,
we can get a clearer picture of the challenges Mozambique is facing.
And maybe, just maybe, we can glimpse a path towards a more peaceful and just future.
That's the hope, isn't it? That through understanding, we can find a way forward.
It is. And this isn't just about Mozambique, is it?
No, this is a story that resonates globally.
Wherever people are fighting for dignity, for opportunity, for a voice,
A universal struggle.
it reminds us that democracy is precious but fragile. It needs constant nurturing, a commitment to justice and equality.
It can't be taken for granted.
Exactly. And peace, it's not just the absence of war, it's the presence of hope, opportunity, a belief that a better future is possible.
A future worth striving for.
And that's why it's so important to engage with these complex issues, to try to understand them, to challenge injustice, to work towards a world where everyone can live in peace and security.
It's a big task, but a necessary one.
Absolutely. And as we continue our deep dive into the unrest in Mozambique, we're going to explore the human impact of this crisis, look at how the region and the world are responding, and think about the potential paths towards a more peaceful and prosperous future.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Yeah,
It's going to be a fascinating and hopefully insightful journey.
definitely.
Stay tuned, folks. We've got a lot more to uncover.
Let's keep digging. Yeah, it's a tough spot for South Africa. They've got pressure from all sides, to do something, but the situation's changing so fast, so sensitive.
It's a real test of their leadership in the region.
For sure. And then you've got that historical link between Frelimo and the ANC, South Africa's ruling party.
Right, that shared history.
That legacy of solidarity, fighting against apartheid together. It adds another layer to any potential intervention,
It does. Makes you wonder, would South Africa be seen as an impartial peacemaker or just trying to help out an old ally?
Right. Perception is everything in these situations.
Totally. Any intervention would have to be so carefully thought out, balancing that need for stability with, not wanting to look like they're interfering in Mozambique's internal affairs.
It was a tightrope walk, for sure.
And all of this is playing out against this backdrop of existing regional challenges.
Yeah, Southern Africa has a lot on its plate.
For real.
Yeah.
Economic disparities, xenophobia, resource scarcity. It's like the region's already a tinderbox.
And this unrest in Mozambique, that's, like you said, throwing a match onto that tinderbox.
It could easily make those existing problems explode.
And that's the worry, isn't it? That domino effect, instability spreading across borders.
Exactly. Like that border between South Africa and Mozambique, it's so important for trade, for both economies.
A lifeline, really.
But it could also become a flashpoint. The increased security it's needed, but it could also disrupt trade, the flow of goods and people.
It's a tough situation, no easy answers.
It is. You try to contain the crisis, but those very actions could backfire.
And hurt the economies even more, which is fuels resentment.
It's a vicious cycle. And like we've said before, it's always the everyday people who pay the price.
Yeah. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the geopolitics, but it's the human cost that really matters.
Those families fleeing the violence, the communities living in fear, the people struggling to make ends meet.
The human side of the story.
Their stories often get overshadowed, but they're the ones bearing the brunt of it all.
For sure. And the impact goes beyond just the physical, too. It's the trauma, the fear, the uncertainty that leaves deep scars.
Scars that can last for generations.
It really makes you think this isn't just some abstract political event happening somewhere else. It's real people's lives being turned upside down.
And it makes the need for a solution, for peace and stability, even more urgent.
Absolutely. But as we've said, it can't just be about cracking down, restoring order. That's just a temporary fix.
It's about addressing those root causes, isn't it?
It is. Creating a Mozambique where everyone feels like they have a chance, a future, where their voices matter, where they can live without fear.
A society that's truly just and equitable.
That's the goal. So as we dig deeper into this complex situation, I think it's time to really focus on those factors that brought Mozambique to this point.
You mean those historical roots we talked about earlier?
Yeah. How did things get so bad? How did we end up here? We need to go back to the beginning, to Mozambique's colonial past, the fight for independence.
Okay, let's rewind. We know Mozambique was a Portuguese colony for a long time.
Almost 500 years.
Right.
And like we've seen in other colonial situations, it was all about exploitation. Extracting resources, controlling the local population.
That's what they could get.
Exactly. And they enforced this rigid social hierarchy, with the Portuguese settlers at the top and the indigenous people pushed to the bottom. No rights, no opportunities, just a source of cheap labor.
A classic colonial system, unfortunately. So when Mozambique finally got its independence in 1975, it was like escaping from this long, dark shadow. What was the atmosphere like back then?
It was this mix of excitement and apprehension, Frelimo, the liberation movement, they came to power with these big socialist ideals. They wanted to create a more equal society, a fairer system.
A fresh start.
That was the dream. But they also inherited a country that had been ravaged by war, the economy was in shambles, and there are these deep social divisions that weren't going to heal overnight.
So they faced enormous challenges right from the start.
Absolutely. And Frelimo's rule, well, it's been the dominant force in Mozambique's post-colonial story. Almost 50 years in power.
That's a long time. What kind of impact has that had on the country, would you say?
It's complicated. In the early years, they made some real progress. Expanded access to education and healthcare, those basic services.
There are positive steps.
Yeah, definitely. But their socialist policies, they also attracted criticism, especially from the West. They saw Frelimo as being too close to the Soviet Union during the Cold War,
Caught in that global power struggle.
Exactly. And internally within Mozambique, there were growing pains too. Not everyone was happy with Frelimo.
So cracks were starting to show.
You could say that. People started to worry about Frelimo's authoritarian tendencies, cracking down on dissents, not really delivering on their promises of economic prosperity.
So a disconnect between their words and actions.
Right. And this discontent, it eventually fueled an armed insurgency. Renamo, they called themselves. And they got support from apartheid-era South Africa and Rhodesia, who wanted to destabilize the newly independent Mozambique.
Another layer of complexity.
It was a proxy war, essentially.
Mozambique caught in this crossfire of global and regional powers. Must have been a turbulent time.
It was. And the war with Renamo, it just added to the devastation. Millions of people displaced, development stalled, and this atmosphere of fear and mistrust took hold, making those existing social tensions even worse.
It sounds like the roots of today's unrest run deep.
They do. You can definitely see the connections. That struggle for liberation, it gave way to new forms of conflict and inequality.
The old wounds never really healed.
Exactly. And in Mozambique, like we talked about earlier, those wounds are deeply connected to land ownership and control over resources.
Yeah.
It's a common theme across a lot of Africa.
Land and resources, always a source of conflict.
Right. Land, it's not just about economics in a lot of African societies. It's tied to identity, to heritage, to a sense of belonging. During colonial rule, vast amounts of land were taken from indigenous communities and given to European settlers.
Creating that legacy of dispossession that continues to this day.
It's a wound that hasn't healed. So even though Mozambique gained political independence, the economic structures remained pretty much the same, which meant that inequality persisted.
Like a ticking time bomb.
A very apt analogy. And then the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly the world was a very different place. How did these global shifts affect Mozambique?
A whole new world order.
Exactly. For Mozambique, it meant a pretty dramatic shift in the political landscape. Without their Soviet backers, Frelimo had to adapt. They started to embrace a more market-oriented approach.
A more capitalist system.
Right. They opened the country up to foreign investment, adopted a multi-party system. It was a big shift away from those socialist ideals of the liberation struggle.
A pragmatic move, you could say.
Exactly. And it did bring some economic benefits. The economy started to grow.
So things were looking up.
On the surface, yes. But that growth came with a downside. Inequality actually got worse.
How so?
Well, foreign investors often partnered with elites who were connected to Frelimo. So wealth and power ended up concentrated in the hands of a select few. The gap between the rich and the poor widened.
So the benefits of economic growth weren't trickling down to everyone.
Exactly. And that created a lot of resentment, especially among those who felt left behind, excluded from the opportunities.
So it's in this context, this legacy of historical grievances and growing economic inequality, that we see the current unrest unfolding.
It's like all those years of simmering tensions finally boiled over. A mix of political frustration, economic hardship, and this deep desire for a more just and equitable society.
And the recent election was the catalyst, the trigger that set it all off.
It seems that way. It's a tragic situation, a reminder of how fragile peace can be, and how easily hope can turn into despair.
It's heartbreaking to see, and it highlights the urgent need to find a way forward, a path towards peace and stability in Mozambique.
Absolutely. But as we've discussed, true peace requires more than just restoring order. It requires addressing those deep-rooted issues, those historical grievances, that sense of injustice that so many Mozambicans feel.
It's about creating a future where everyone feels like they have a chance, where their voices are heard, where their basic needs are met.
It's a long and difficult road ahead. But the alternative, continued conflict and instability, is simply unacceptable. The stakes are too high.
So we've been really digging into the situation in Mozambique, right? The history, the politics, the economics, all the factors that led to this unrest. But now the question is, where do we go from here? What's next for Mozambique?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, it's a question that only Mozambicans themselves can answer. But we can explore some possibilities, right? Analyze what's at stake and think about what steps could lead to a more stable and hopefully just future.
Okay, so let's start with the here and now. We've got ongoing protests, violence escalating, thousands of escaped prisoners. It's a mess. What needs to happen right now to get things under control?
Well, the absolute priority has to be de-escalation. All sides need to work together, reduce the violence, create a space for dialogue, start building some trust.
That sounds pretty tough in a situation like this where tensions are so high and everyone's suspicious of each other.
It's definitely a huge challenge, but I don't think it's impossible. We've seen in other conflicts around the world that even when things seem darkest, there are always people, individuals, organizations working behind the scenes to try and build bridges, mediate disputes, find some common ground.
Those unsung heroes.
Exactly. Their efforts often go unnoticed, but they're the ones laying the groundwork for any kind of lasting peace.
What about the international community? We've heard calls for intervention, especially from South Africa. Could that help stabilize things?
Well, international involvement can be tricky. It can be helpful, sure, providing mediation, humanitarian aid, supporting those peace-building efforts, but it's got to be done carefully.
Right, sensitive to the situation.
Yeah, respecting Mozambique's sovereignty. You don't want to come in like you're imposing solutions or make it look like colonialism all over again.
It's walking a fine line, isn't it? Supporting without dictating.
Exactly. And that's where regional organizations like the Southern African Development Community, SADC, they can be really valuable.
Why SADC specifically?
Well, they understand the regional dynamics better, the historical relationships, the cultural nuances. Their involvement is likely to be seen as more legitimate, less intrusive than, say, intervention from Western powers.
So they could be more of a mediator, helping facilitate dialogue rather than a force coming in and saying, this is how it's going to be.
Exactly. They can use their relationships with the different groups, encourage compromise, provide a neutral platform for negotiations.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's be realistic here. Mediation and dialogue, that's just one piece of the puzzle. If Mozambique really wants lasting peace, they have to address the root causes of this unrest, right?
Absolutely. No quick fixes here. Mozambique has to face those deep-seated issues head-on. Inequality, corruption, lack of opportunity, these are the things that fuel the crisis in the first place.
So where do you even begin to tackle problems that are so deeply entrenched? It's a huge undertaking.
It is a monumental task, but it's not impossible. It requires a multi-pronged approach. Political, economic, and social reforms all working together to create a more just and equitable society.
So what would those reforms look like specifically?
Well, on the political side, it's about strengthening those democratic institutions, making sure elections are truly free and fair, creating a level playing field for all parties, tackling corruption head-on, promoting transparency, holding those in power accountable.
Making sure that people feel like they have a voice, a stake in the system, that their leaders are actually working for them.
Exactly. And economically, it's about creating opportunities for all Mozambicans, not just a select few. Investing in education, job training, promoting entrepreneurship, making sure that economic growth benefits everyone.
So moving away from that model where a small elite profits from the country's resources and towards something more inclusive, something that empowers ordinary citizens.
Right. A more sustainable path to prosperity for everyone. And it's not just about economic policies. It's about tackling those social inequalities that have been around for so long. Investing in healthcare, making sure people have access to clean water, sanitation, and really empowering those marginalized communities.
Wow, it sounds like a complete system overhaul, a transformation, not just a quick fix.
It's a long-term project, for sure, a generational one, you could say, but it's a project worth undertaking if Mozambique wants to break free from this cycle of violence and instability that's been plaguing it for so long.
A long road ahead.
It is, and it's a journey that needs strong leadership, vision, and a real commitment from everyone, from all levels of society.
And what about the role of the international community? What can they do to help?
They can offer support, resources, expertise, stand in solidarity with the people of Mozambique. But ultimately, the path to a better future, it lies in the hands of Mozambicans themselves.
It's a reminder that peace isn't something that's given, it's something that has to be built step by step.
Through dialogue, compromise, and a shared commitment to justice and equality.
And even when things seem hopeless, there's always that flicker of hope, right? For a better future, a more just world.
Every crisis, no matter how bad, it presents an opportunity. A chance for growth, transformation, a chance to build something better.
So for our listeners out there, the situation in Mozambique, it's complex, it's challenging, and it's still unfolding. But within all that complexity, there are glimmers of hope, signs of resilience, and this deep desire for a better future. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never forget the human stories, the individual lives that are at the heart of this crisis.
Because ultimately, it's those individual stories, those voices, those hopes and dreams that will shape the future of Mozambique.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the unrest in Mozambique. We'll continue to follow the story as it develops, and we encourage you to do the same. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world. Until next time.